Hello and welcome to the Barbell Nerds podcast. My name is Sean Fantuzzi. I'm with my co-host Will Rattel. We are welcoming by popular demand, just from his brother, Scott Kuehn, another member of the Fritter Friday family that we have rolling on. Scott, we're happy to have you, man. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be on. Thank you for having me.
All right. Scott is the assistant strength and conditioning coach with the Arizona Wildcat football team. Scott, that's as much of an introduction as I'm going to give you. You get to do the honors yourself. Tell us who you are, where you've been, a little bit about Scott.
All right. So I'm originally from the Chicagoland area, born and raised, went to high school there, went to college downstate at Illinois State University. I was a walk-on football player turned scholarship athlete that played my last game in an FCS national championship. Unfortunately, watched Carson Wentz go down the field with 1:30 left in the game to beat us. But I guess if you're going to lose an FCS title like that and have that be your last game, that's not a terrible way to lose it. But really to backtrack a little bit and get more into the roots of how I came to be in strength and conditioning, my interest in sport performance started in middle school, which sounds crazy to say because I was in middle school from 2004 to 2006. But that was when I had begun doing private sector training with a group called Acceleration that's really starting to gain some popularity with the things they do from both a training standpoint, and then they have a 7-on-7 program as well. But I thought it was fascinating that there was a science to making people better at their sport or improving their athletic performance. And I was going there 3 times a week, all the way through the end of my high school career. And then when I was home on breaks during college, I'd go back and I'd just work out there. Like it was that and home, and that was pretty much it. But that was really where my love for sport performance began. And then when I got to college, I realized you can do it in a much more focused setting where you have like-minded individuals that are working towards a collective goal versus, let me go ahead and turn my notifications off, apologies. But where I realized, you can have this more focused group working together versus private sector. You could have a kid from, an 18-year-old football player, a 12-year-old soccer player, a 14-year-old tennis player, and you're babysitting an 8-year-old that doesn't want to be there. His parents just paid for athletic babysitting for the hour. So it's just the lack of focused approach and the lack of the intangible aspects of the team culture and the camaraderie and trying to work towards a common purpose were what were missing for me when I started working in the private sector. Just so I would do some intern-like work for them starting my senior year of high school. And then when I realized that gets taken off the table when you get into collegiate strength and conditioning, that was when I knew I wanted to be a strength coach. And so that in conjunction, knowing very early in my college career that I wanted to do that, I of course began very, critically looking at what it was we were doing from a preparatory standpoint, and began reading a lot on Elite FTS when James Smith was doing a lot of articles and forum discussion posts with their group. And he had posted a few articles talking about concepts like practice design and program management and some of the fundamental flaws that were, running rampant at that point and still run rampant to this day. And, of course, it began this appraisal of what we were doing and some of the things he had talked about, and just realizing that it didn't make sense the way that we were practicing, the way that we were training. And that really started my interest in figuring out what are other places doing? How are they preparing their athletes to meet the demands of college football in particular? And that was when I stumbled on a video of a guy named Eric Corum talking about what they were doing at Kentucky. And it was like this huge flashbulb moment. It's really funny because Keir talks about the same videos that drew him to wanting to work for Eric at William & Mary. So it's a very funny, how that group of William & Mary came to be. But it was just a huge light bulb moment of Eric talking about high performance and realizing, this is what training should be. This is what preparation for sports should be. And so I just immersed myself in anything and everything I could find around the concepts he talked about. So flash forward 3 years, played my last game, done, didn't make it with trying to play professionally, got a job as a high school head strength coach at a high school in my hometown. And Eric was speaking at the CVAP seminar out in Richmond. And I begged, borrowed, and pleaded with my parents to help me fund a trip out there because I was a broke high school strength coach immediately, having just graduated. And so I went out there, and conveniently, like, it worked out that he presented the first night. He was going to leave to go to another seminar he had. Followed him out, or stalked him out, as he'll tell you. But tapped him on the shoulder and just said, I love what you're doing at Kentucky, and I'd love to come be a part of it. And 2 weeks later, I moved to Lexington, Kentucky, and interned for him for a semester, which was, that Dunning-Kruger curve where you get up to like the top and you think you know a lot and you don't really have a lot of experience. I was probably there when I was a high school head strength coach because it was like things went well. The kids loved me. That was still one of the most pure experiences that I've had as a coach. To all of a sudden plummeting and still feeling like I'm plummeting after, having worked with Kier the last 2 years, Kier and Eric. But just huge plummet into like what it is at the highest level. I mean, it was SEC football, and all the kids that I worked with that year were the seniors on the team that went 10-3 a few years back. So all that potential was in that team. They were just so much more physically immature and undeveloped compared to their SEC counterparts. And so it was still a tremendous experience. I got to see that high performance approach in year 3 of its implementation. And then also learn from some of the more intangible aspects of, staff culture, team culture, how to bring the entire picture together. Went home, worked in the private sector, applied for GA positions. Was able to land one at the University of Tulsa. So I went down to Tulsa, Oklahoma for 2 years. Great experience of being part of a football 5, also getting some teams of my own that I had charge of with programming. And really I enjoyed my time there. I think Tulsa is one of my favorite cities in the country. Just super multicultural, super unique mix of places to go, things to do. Again, just a really formative time for me, especially on the data side of things, because they were collecting a good bit of data there, but they weren't readily using it. It was just a lot of numbers sitting in a sheet. And I remember reading one of the CVAP's manuals, and I believe it was Hewitt Tomlin wrote one of the chapters in the book talking about just how to color code and derive meaning from data. And so I took some segments of our data and did that, and thus began my my work with a lot of the dashboard type stuff, reporting type work that I do now. And incidentally, that ended up becoming the small portfolio that I was able to send to Eric when he got back to me saying he was going to have a job at William & Mary in summer 2018. And so I was able to show him, here's what I've done at Tulsa, here's what we do from a reporting standpoint. And that was what helped me get into my role as coordinator of data science and athletics performance coach there, which I was still vastly underprepared for with what Eric wanted to be able to do and his vision for that department. So it was really a huge moment of getting chucked in the deep end. But again, very, very luckily, I had Eric there, and then of course Kier there to mentor me and to really help me to grow through everything I was able to learn, both on an implicit level and an explicit level from my time there at William & Mary. To this day, and probably going forward, will probably be one of the most formative experiences for me as a coach was working with them, and some of the experiences I got to have with the teams that I worked with there. And that brought me to where I'm at now. So I know it's kind of gotten around to this point that the things at William & Mary were starting to so the job at University of Arizona was part trying to get out of that, but then it was also a tremendous opportunity for me to go with someone that Eric spoke very, very highly of. We worked together at Florida State, and he was a tremendous leader for you to have. You're going to be able to do everything that you're doing here, but in a much more focused manner of just having football. And it's the chance to work Power 5 football. Like, it's a higher level. There's more resources to work with. I do think one of the silver linings of working at smaller schools is you learn how to be innovative with less. And so to kind of have that progression of, I saw what it can be at an SEC school as an intern, and then I went to kind of a middle tier school with Tulsa, to going to William & Mary, where we really didn't have much of anything and we had to do a lot with a little. To now I'm at Power 5 school, where we have the resources that are in place to do the job really well and really effectively, but still have that innovative mindset about how we can do things even better. So that's where I'm at currently, and it's been a interesting 3 months to say the least. At first I got here and we weren't having a season. We were just in off-season mode for what looked to be a really long 16 weeks. And then Pac-12 walked back their cancellation of the season, and we just played our first game yesterday after getting canceled the previous week. So that's where I'm at now.
Can you talk about your experience at the high school level? Because I don't think, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't had anyone on here who has really worked too much with high school kids, besides like Lee Taft, but that's more in the private sector. But as like a high school specific strength and conditioning coach, can you just talk about your experience there?
Yeah, so it worked out really well that as soon as like all the pro day training finished up and it was apparent nothing was going to happen, I started looking at high schools in the area because I was still living at home, of course, and just trying to get on my feet as a starting out pro strength coach. And my alma mater, they said, well, we can bring you on as an assistant, even though I was, had far more credentialing and experience than the guy that they had in charge there. But then the head football coach at the other high school in the district remembered me from my playing days, had kind of kept up with the fact that I had just finished playing and, that I had some success at Illinois State. And after a couple conversations, he was willing to bring me in. And it helped that I was so young at that point, because I would have been 22 or 23 when I took that job. And then I just played for a national championship, because I could have told those kids to run into a brick wall and it would have made them a better football player. And they all would have done it, no hesitation. But that was...
So you're saying you didn't do that?
I did not do that, but I could have. But again, like I said earlier, that was one of the purest experiences, because you're working with a bunch of kids that the vast majority are not going to play at the next level. So you're not dealing with kids that are concerned about touches. They want the ability to develop mostly the confidence in themselves from a mental emotional standpoint. The physical confidence obviously comes with it, but I think at a deeper level, especially with the society we're growing up in, there's a huge emphasis on putting on a best face, but then there's this, it's just an empty shell of it. They haven't really ever truly built up the confidence in themselves to carry them through life and to deal with adversity and to learn how to appreciate the long-term process of working for something. And, it was me, and I had close to 200 kids in that program. So I would work sessions of about 80 kids by myself, and you learn how to coach really, really effectively and to write sessions that flow logistically very, very quickly when you have to figure out how to get 80 kids through. I actually had a very good weight room set up for the high school level, but it's not designed to have 80 kids in it trying to train in an hour. So you learn how to be really, really efficient with the sessions you write, and you learn how to kind of flow the sessions so that you've got the right kids in at the right time. And as soon as they're finishing up, the next group's flowing right in from whatever they were doing in the hallway. So thoroughly enjoyed that. To me, it reinforced that should the collegiate sector ever just the volatility of it, should that ever get to be too much and to take away from wanting to settle down, have my own home, family, spend more time with my family, I could be very happy just working as a high school strength coach again and doing that and enjoying all of the perks of strength and conditioning without necessarily the downsides that come with the collegiate field.
I've actually thought long and hard about if my high school alma mater were to, I've reached out to them in the past and been like, hey, is there a plan to implement a strength and conditioning coach, performance coach title? And they said, no, it's not really something we're really looking for, unfortunately, because we had like a graduating class of 600 when I was there, and then they just had graduating class of like 850. So the high school that I went to is massive, and it shells out athletes. It's a breeding ground for athletes. Yeah. So I've always wondered, like, that high school, how that high school life is with everyone at school from like sometime to sometime.
I mean, it was
how was it
in the summer, and so it was like 4 hours a day.
Yeah.
plus football practice. So it was like I got there at 7, set up, everything on my own, which I was totally fine with. And then groups would start flowing in. I'd coach my butt off for 3 or 4 straight hours. And then depending on the day, if we had football practice, it'd be an hour and a half of football practice and then be done. So it was, just really, really intense work for a couple hours, but then I had the rest of the day to myself. So it was very manageable to do. And it aligns with much more with how, I tend to work best currently, where it's, really, really concentrated hard work for a burst and then rest from there. So I loved it and would definitely welcome the chance to do it again in hopefully a much more significantly paid role than I was when I was there.
Very cool. Will, do you have anything on that?
No, I have another question about your experience with collecting data when you were at Tulsa. Mm-hmm. What was that like? And I've talked about it before. I dug into it really deep, like the sports science, the data collection. About a year ago, I was just really deep into it, and I kind of got overwhelmed with all the data that I was collecting that none of it was actionable. So could you talk about your experience with that? Did you have the same experience that I had? What specific type of data were you collecting? Is it force plate stuff? Is it velocity-based stuff? Could you just
is that where you started with your GPS data too?
No, I started with GPS at William & Mary.
Okay. We'll get into that after this.
Okay. So Tulsa was really, admittedly, I didn't get too overwhelmed by it at first because they weren't collecting a ton. It was some pretty simple, they were using the polar heart rate system. And so it was like training load data, looking at acute to chronic ratios, and it eventually expanded. We tried to build on the project each semester. It eventually expanded to wellness data, and we only collected on certain athletes, so guys that we were getting regular data on. And then we eventually got into omega wave data, which was something I'd become familiar with at Kentucky, but then also I ended up buying one for myself to use. And so I was pretty familiar with using it to be prescriptive based upon day-to-day readiness to train. So I think the graduated approach of adding in another stream of data each semester after we got comfortable with systemizing the way which we were using, the initial data set and then the added data set, I think that made it very easy to not get overwhelmed because, I think there's this notion that, like, especially when you just get into like the CSV exports of some of the data platforms that you can work with in sport or in sports science, it's like, holy shit, what do I pull out of this? And so starting with that and kind of gradually building out helped me to avoid that overwhelming feeling that probably drives people away from being, too invested in utilizing data for what it can be. Where I really had the overwhelming feeling was at William & Mary, which was in part due to the sheer workload we had. I was, first and foremost an athletics performance coach there. But then the data science role I had was also working across all 23 of our teams. So, I had 190 athletes that I was responsible for between the football team, men's and women's soccer, and then women's lacrosse as well. Women's lacrosse had their own GPS system, which was different from the player tech system that the football team had. But so it was just, there was just a lot, and it forced me to be an inch deep and a mile wide rather than what I get to do here at Arizona, which is be an inch wide and a mile deep with what I'm doing. But I really hadn't had any GPS experience, and part of the pull of going to William & Mary was, Eric telling me he would, kind of help me become well-versed and nuanced in GPS. But I still struggled very heavily initially with what's important to look at, because again, I think it's one of those things that you hear people talk about it. You've got this impression that it has to be super complex and you've got to have tables and spider charts and multiple graphs and lines. And it's just like, it's made up to be this completely complex thing, when my experience here at Arizona thus far has taught me it really doesn't need to be. And, if you can be much simpler and much more direct with a few things rather than trying to worry about how many high IMAs at the 9 o'clock vector a kid hit. I think a lot of the micro pieces of GPS data can be dictated by the macro of pulling back and figuring out what are the action points for intervening and for creating the practice structures that you want to see. And to go back to William and Mary, I think one of the cool things that kind of reinforced more of the phenomenological approach. I had to think about how to say that word for a second. But that reinforced a more phenomenological approach to preparation is I really didn't look too much at the GPS system with my lacrosse team in their first season. A lot of my time and efforts were focused more so on getting into concepts around tactical periodization, and especially in a sport that I knew nothing about, being a Midwest kid. Like, lacrosse is just getting big in Chicagoland area, but it was not a thing when I was growing up. So I was still kind of learning about the sport itself. There's not a lot of literature around normatives for game demands from a mechanical or physiological perspective. So I was the beneficiary there of that staff was in its 5th year of underperforming. Eric had come in over the previous summer and had part of the stipulation was that they would be kept on if they worked within this high performance model that Eric brought to William and Mary. So he spent the summer educating them on concepts around tactical periodization, high-low model, what stress is, motor learning, and skill acquisition. So when I came in August, I was sitting down in a meeting with these coaches, and we were talking about the high-low structure of the first week. And it was like kind of, excuse me, a mind-numbing moment of I'm talking about these things with sport coaches. And that group was super agreeable, tremendous personalities. We all got along on the human level, which made it even better that everyone was so agreeable and enjoyed being around each other. And that wasn't to say we weren't without conflict at moments, but it wasn't conflict in the name of emotion. It was concepts, or it was conflicts, just working through differing viewpoints from a logical perspective. And so I put a lot of time and effort into figuring out, because I was able to dictate the practice structure, how long we practice, what spacing of the field we use, how difficult it should be from an intensity standpoint. And so when we got into the spring season, that was my main focal point, was making sure we got that right, from how we built up in the preseason to how we undulated our practice loads throughout the season, just because the volatility of the turnaround time between games is anywhere between 2 to 12 days. So I think there's a very strategic opportunity there if you leverage the games as training stressors themselves to be fresher than teams who might think, well, we've got another game in 2 days, we've got to practice hard on the day in between. And what was really cool about that, I did kind of a retrospective GPS analysis after that, was that the GPS data took care of itself because we got the practice structures right around the games. So you saw this high-low ebb and flow of the metrics that we were trying to hit, from, total distance, high-speed distances, explosive distance. Those things took care of themselves because we got things right, like how long we practiced, how intense it was, what emphasis points we put on the work to rest ratios of different drills. Those things took care of themselves. So that was my first reinforcing point of, okay, let's try and use the way we structure the practice and, much more hard and fast outlining of those parameters versus worrying about, well, this girl hit a 570 player load, she needs to be done for the day. She could have been dancing on the sideline for 10 minutes while she was out, and that player load accumulated. And it's like, all right, well, we've taken her out for nothing. So now that I've gotten that through that first year and into that second year, where I was working with a new coaching staff, and it was about, that taught me more about how to bring somebody in who's never been brought around concepts like GPS and tactical periodization. How do I leverage the system and the data that we have from previous years to demonstrate the efficacy of what we were doing? And luckily we had some tremendous data to speak from, where we had a 50% increase in wins, 83% reduction in injuries in that first year. And every single girl was available to play in every single game besides a girl who got her hand broken by a stick check, which obviously you can't do much about. Then we had massive physical improvements, speed, power, conditioning. So it made it an easier selling point to say, look, these girls believe in this, and objectively it's improved things you care about, which is winning fundamentally, and then obviously injury rates, because girls who are available to practice are going to get better at the sport. And obviously the underpinning physical qualities that you want to see improved, those all improved with it. So it made it much easier to sell and to learn how to go through that process of bringing somebody on board to that way of thinking about sport preparation. But that was the great lesson that I had to learn. And so it was all the summation of those experiences that brought me to Arizona. And interestingly enough, a project that I was working on over quarantine that I posted a screenshot of is what led me to getting the job at Arizona. I joke all the time that I got a job off of social media, because that was what spurred the conversation between Brian and I about he was looking for somebody to take their GPS system and really run with it. And so here I am now.
Was there ever a time where you kind of disagreed with what the data was telling you, and maybe the data was telling you to adjust something, but for whatever reason, like your subjective judgment didn't agree with what the data was showing, and you questioned some of the decision making you had to make?
The way I've always looked at the data is more that it should influence decisions. It shouldn't make decisions. So it's a piece of the pie. It's not the whole pie itself. And making sure to always have kept that in mind. You know, that's what they tell you with Omega Wave is, you know, it's not telling you can't do something. It's just telling you that there's probably a higher cost if you do proceed as prescribed. So I tried to always keep that as, you know, I'm not the nerd behind the computer only looking at the screen. I'm looking up and making sure that I understand the human aspect of what it is that we're doing, and the humans that I'm working with, and what needs to get done from a preparatory standpoint to put athletes in the best position to succeed. So obviously if we're doing an install for a game, lacrosse or football or whatever sport it may be, and we get an athlete that comes back, they're red on Omega Wave, their acute chronic is up on their mechanical loads. It's not, depending on how they feel, obviously, it's not immediately revert to they need to be pulled from practice today and sit there and do nothing. It's, okay, can they maybe just take 50% of the team reps, and for Indy, they're doing, you know, like a calisthenics based like warm up, or they're doing stary skill work or extensive skill work, something like that, to where they're not involved in higher intensity aspects of practice, but they're involved in the ones that matter most for preparation. And then on my end, what can I adjust to make sure that they're in the best position to succeed when they come to me for training? So like there were days where we had girls that were consistently in the red on their Omega Wave, and it was those conversations of, you know, let's get them in the group periods and taking 50% of the reps. And then when they came in with me, it was extensive med balls, extensive plyos, and then go get treatment on what was ailing them in the training room. So they didn't do the full training session like their teammates did. So I've always made sure to not let the data tell me what to do, but more so give a little bit more color to a picture that I already know is there, and then make the decision based on all things considered.
I think that's a pretty big, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's a pretty big discrepancy between being able to use the data and take action on the data, depending on how comfortable you feel making those decisions. You're not making the data make the decisions. You truly are. You're just interpreting and spinning it out and throwing it basically back at your head coach. How have those conversations with those head coaches been? Have they been receptive to a lot of this probably new type of training, new type of practice structure with the GPS data that you have?
So which coaching staff are we talking about? Lacrosse year one, lacrosse year two, or Arizona football?
Let's go lacrosse year one. Lacrosse year one.
Year one was super great because I could tell them, hey, these girls are in a rough place. We may need to adjust these things. and it was done. So that was super, super easy to do. It was a true high performance director role that I was in there on obviously a smaller scale of it only being a lacrosse team. And one of the factors that made that far more manageable is the amount of degrees of freedom that were in the program, which it was me, 3 lacrosse coaches, and an AT. So you don't have near the complexity that you get when you start to get to like a football staff where you've got position coaches, analysts, quality control, strength staff, a bunch of ATs that just add a lot of degrees of freedom to trying to get people fundamentally aligned. But so it was super, super easy for me to come in and be able to be like, hey, these girls are XYZ, she's good to go, she's not, how can we adjust what she needs for what she needs, and so on and so have you. And like one of the moments that I remember standing out to me was the day where top up, because it had been 2 or 3 weeks since a lot of them had touched their max velocity, but we also had a limited window of practice that I had put in place for them, and they didn't want to take away from that. So what they ended up doing was putting together a cradling drill that the girls would cradle through a couple of defenders, and then they would have them open up and sprint for 30 yards after that. So they would effectively work on finishing and clearing the ball upfield. So I got what I needed. Lacrosse coaches got their indie work done for the day. And best of both worlds. You took what one group needed, what another individual needed, and you put it together and you made it even better, and you made it more efficient for the girls. So now you're not just elongating practice and accumulating more on feet time for the girls that probably, at that point, I want to say we were starting to taper into the season. So adding more time to that is obviously going to decrease the efficacy of that taper. So we got it done, and those are the types of conversations we were able to have and the types of solutions we were able to arrive at.
So we're running short on time here, Scott. So I just have one quick question for you, which would be, let's just say working with a sport like football, lacrosse, or soccer, since they're all somewhat similar in the time motion characteristics, what recommendation would you give for a coach who wants to implement like the sports science or the technology, or just say GPS? What's one recommendation you give for a coach?
I'm sorry, you kind of broke up a little bit there. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. So let's just we'll just say for football only. What's one recommendation you would give for a coach that wants to implement GPS tracking? What's like one measure or one metric you'd say, look for, this is worth looking for? Just one recommendation.
I think understanding the time motion demands of it, like you kind of alluded to initially, I heard that part. How long is the ball in play? How long is the ball out of play? Especially in an intermittent sport like football, that makes it a lot easier than a game like lacrosse or soccer where it's continuous, and especially with some of the rule changes in lacrosse where you can make substitutions on the fly, kind of like hockey. But if you understand how long it's in play, how long it's not, and then you can put a little phenomenology behind it to look at football and say, oh, it's a maximal effort acceleration if you're a skilled position, or if you're obviously close to the ball, it's a more force dominant collision. It's a maximal effort of whatever for 4 to 6 seconds, and then you get 30 to 40 seconds of rest. Okay, does our practice look like that? I think a lot of people, if you were to just look at like a trace of practice, you'd see a lot of medium intensity efforts with not a lot of break. And I think one of the things that gets lost, especially in putting together practice structures, is the way that one period goes into the next, so on and so forth. And you end up with this 90-minute, 2-hour stream of medium intensity reps. So versus if you look at like a football game velocity trace, it's going to be, I think the average plays per drive is 6. So you're going to see 6 major spikes with 30 seconds of rest, 40 seconds of rest in between, and then you're going to see them sit. The average from a paper from Mikel Ioza, the average series rest for a Division I football game is 11.5 minutes. So you're going to see 6 efforts, maximal intensity with 30 seconds, 40 seconds of rest in between, and then you're going to see them sit on their butt for 11.5 minutes. How often does your football practice look like that? Right. For a lot of coaches, never. So even just getting coaches to insert rest into what they're doing, put actual breaks in, focus on how many reps you're giving per period, per segment, and then just let them stand there, sit there like they're going to do during the game. I think if you focus on that, the time motion demands, and that's where you can look at like the player load per minute, which is kind of the work rate. When you insert those breaks, the work rate comes down accordingly, and inherently the intensity goes up. So I think if you're going to anchor on one metric, looking at player load per minute, obviously volume's a concern too, but look at how much work they're doing and how quickly they're accumulating it, and that'll set you up to understand.
That nugget, that last like 2 minutes, 3 minutes of information was worth this entire podcast. So Scott, we wanted to thank you so much for being on with us today. We'll definitely be catching up at some point in the near future. But give us one person to reach out to get them on this for us.
Mike Nicholas from Acceleration Sports Performance.
Say that again.
Mike Nicholas from Acceleration Sports Performance.
Got it. All right, we'll write that down. We'll get connected with them, and we'll make that happen. Scott, again, thank you so much. Couldn't appreciate it more.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Take care. Have a great day.